Every street had one. Most had two or three. Before you knew anyone in a new place, you knew where the pub was. The one on the corner, the one at the bottom of the hill, the one your father stopped at on the way home on a Friday without ever needing to explain why. In 1970s Britain, the pub wasn't somewhere you went occasionally. It was somewhere you went constantly. After work on a Tuesday at lunchtime, on the way home before your tea, then back again in the evening. It wasn't an event. It was just where life happened, before wine bars, before the changed behaviour, before anything resembling a healthy relationship with alcohol. Let's step into that world. The first thing you noticed, before your eyes adjusted to the amber dimness, was the smell. Beer soaked into old wood. And cigarette smoke lying in the horizontal layers just below the ceiling. Something faintly fried from out the back. Wet wool from whoever had just come in from the rain. And underneath all of it, a particular warmth. Not luxury warmth, just the warmth of a room with too many people in it. In 1970s, Britain, when your house had single glazing and one coal fire heating, 2 rooms at most, that warmth alone was reason enough to be there. The pub was divided, not by law, but by something older than law. In the north of England, where the working class pub culture was densest, in the Victorian terraced rows near the mills and the steelworks and the factories, the bar side had a washable floor, plain wooden stools. Men came in straight from the shift, still in their scruffs. The lounge or best side had carpet, upholstered seating, and women wore their good shoes in there. You could smell the difference between the 2 rooms without crossing the threshold. The bar side smelled of work, the lounge smelled of Estee Lauder Youth Dew and whatever the brewery had put in the bitter that week. Some pubs also had a snug, a tiny private room, barely bigger than a corridor, with bells fixed around the wall that you rang for table service. Some had an off-sales hatch in the corner where people brought jugs from home to get filled and carry away. Dimple pint glasses hung from hooks above the bar, thick and heavy in the hand. The bar top was mahogany, or something pretending to be mahogany, worn smooth in front of the pump handles from decades of forearms. The pumps were brass and ceramic, the brewery name fading off them. And there was sometimes sawdust on the floor in the early part of the decade. Practical, industrial, no pretense about it. The carpets where they existed had patterns dark enough to hide everything, and had been hiding everything since before most of the regulars were born. The lighting was the lighting of a room where nobody had added a bulb since the fitting went in. Amber, low, slightly conspiratorial, frosted glass on the windows. What happened inside was not meant to be visible from the street. The landlord and landlady ran the room the way a magistrate runs a courtroom, with authority that was not granted but assumed. They knew who you were, what you drank, who you came with, whether you were likely to cause trouble, and whether you deserved the nod that meant another one was already being pulled before you asked. And the landladies in the Victorian terraced pubs, particularly in the north, held this authority more completely than most. You did not argue with the landlady. You did not make a scene in front of the landlady. She had seen everything and served everyone, and her patience for nonsense had expired sometime around 1962. When you bought a round and wanted to tip, you did not leave coins on the bar. You said and won for yourself, and she or he would acknowledge this with a small nod that meant more than any amount of loose change. Regulars were demigods. Everyone who drank in the same pub 5 nights a week understood this. A regular had their own stool, sometimes their own glass, kept behind the bar. Their order was remembered without being asked. If you sat in a regular's seat, even on a quiet Monday, and even if they hadn't arrived yet, you would not be told to move in so many words. You would simply become aware through a particular atmospheric shift that a correction was needed. You would feel it before anyone said a thing. And the regular who came in every evening after clocking off, who brought his wage packet home on Friday and handed it to his wife, who handed him back his beer money for the week, that man was not just a customer, he was the pub's continuity. The same stool, the same order, the same 6 people in the same positions every Tuesday at 7. You could walk in on any weeknight and find them there. That was not a coincidence. That was the point. This matters. The pub in the 1970s was not just somewhere to drink. For a significant number of people, and particularly working class men in the industrial towns, It was the alternative to a house that was cold, cramped and full. Single glazing, one fire, multiple family members in a small space. The pub had a working heating system company and nobody asking you to do anything. After a day at the steelworks or the factory or the pit, you stopped in on the way home, not necessarily to get drunk, just to decompress, to be in a warm room with other adults before returning to the domestic world. Then dinner on the table when you got in. Your wife had cooked it. That was the social contract of the era, and the pub was the hinge on which it turned. Bitter, that was the order. Not a pint of something or what have you got? Just bitter, because bitter was what there was and everyone already knew it. On 11.5 pence a pint in February 1971, the month Britain went decimal. Tetley's in Yorkshire, Ansell's in the Midlands, Boddington's in Manchester. You didn't name the brewery. You pointed at the pump and the barman understood. 3 pints at lunchtime was a reasonable break. You went back to work afterwards. Nobody thought twice about it. Some men drank mild, darker, slightly sweeter, a penny or two cheaper than bitter, and by the 1970s already carrying the faint suggestion of an older man's drink. Your grandfather drank mild. At the steelworks in Sheffield and Rotherham, furnace men were still being issued beer tickets in the early part of the decade. A holdover from the industrial era, the idea being that men working near blast furnaces needed replacing what they sweated out. A pint of mild at the end of the shift, to drunks standing at the bar near the factory gate before getting on the bus home. Nobody questioned the arrangement. Lager was arriving, and the old guard viewed it with the specific suspicion British people reserve for things that are clearly going to win. Harp, Heineken, Carlsberg, Watney's Red Barrel, cold, fizzy, the bottles listed at 11 pence on the 1971 price list. Younger men in cities were ordering it. Older men considered this a character flaw. Camera, the campaign for real ale, had been founded in 1971 by 4 men in a pub in Donegal who were tired of being served pressurised keg beer when they wanted cask ale. By the mid-70s, the campaign had thousands of members. Ordering a pint of real ale in the right pub had acquired a faintly political quality. You were making a statement with your drink. And the statement was that you knew what beer was supposed to taste like, and this wasn't it. Women had their drinks, and they were specific. Baby Cham, Sparkling Perry, the leaping deer printed on the branded champagne glass, was everywhere. Advocate mixed with lemonade into a snowball, which was practically obligatory at Christmas. A port and lemon, a gin and orange. Women who drank bitter were noticed. Women who ordered pints were noticed considerably more. The half-pint glass existed largely as the socially sanctioned vessel for women who wanted beer without the implied statement of a full pint. Nobody wrote any of this down. Nobody needed to. Then there were the combinations that every pub had but nobody officially acknowledged. An M&M was Murphy's and mild. A golden was lager and bitter together. A snakebite was cider and lager, which had a reputation for getting people into difficulty at a speed that surprised everyone, including themselves. These were ordered by name at the bar and made without comment. They were not on any menu. They were part of the oral tradition passed between regulars, like instructions for something slightly illicit. The round system was not optional. You arrived with people, someone bought the first round, and from that point a social obligation existed, as binding as any contract. You bought your round before anyone bought 2. You did not leave before your turn. The man who consistently avoided his round, who always seemed to need to get away just as it came to him, was remembered. Not confronted, not challenged, just remembered quietly for years, and the round kept everyone drinking at roughly the same pace. One which was the pace of the fastest drinker, and over an evening a man who had planned on 3 pints would find himself at 6 without having made a conscious decision. And you could go 5 or 6 nights a week as an 18-year-old. At 15 pence a pint you could have a full evening for under £1. Change from £1 some nights if the round fell kindly. Early doors was the stop between work and home. You clocked off at the factory or the office, walked past the pub, and went in for 1 or 2 before heading back for your tea. It wasn't a session, it was a decompression. And the same faces every evening at the same time, the conversation picking up where it had left off the previous day. By 6:30 the bar would be filling with the shift change men, still in their work clothes, the smell of the factory still on them. And standing at the bar in the public side because that was their side and they had always used it. Early doors was not glamorous, it was just part of the day, as unremarkable as the bus home that came afterwards. Darts was serious. The board hung at the end of the public bar, lit from above, the oche marked on the floor. When someone was throwing, the room reduced itself. Conversation dropping, movement near the board stopping. You did not rattle glasses during a throw. The best darts player in the pub held a status difficult to explain outside it. Not famous, not loud, simply better than everyone else at the thing the pub measured, and that counted for everything in that room. And there were evenings when the entire point of being there was the match and not the drinking, though the drinking was happening regardless. Dominoes at a corner table, played with a seriousness that made observation feel intrusive. Cribbage, the scoring board worn smooth, and sometimes a piano. Some pubs had a regular pianist who played for pints, came in on a Thursday or Friday, settled at the upright in the corner, and played until the room filled up around him. T-Rex on the jukebox at 10p for 3 plays, then someone starting the chorus of something on the piano and half the bar joining in. Raucous sing-alongs that went on longer than anyone planned. The jukebox and the pianist existed in permanent negotiation with each other and with the general noise of the room. The landlord had a position on volume. And the landlord always had a position. Women's access was real but uneven. In most pubs by the 1970s, you could come in as a woman without incident, as long as you used the right entrance and sat in the right part. The lounge was yours. The public bar was the public bar, and a woman sitting alone at the bar on the public side was making a statement she may not have intended. Groups of women were fine. A woman alone at the bar attracted a particular kind of attention that was not always welcome and was never entirely absent. Serving a half pint in a lady's glass to a man was the kind of mistake you made once. The room let you know immediately. You did not make it again. The 3-day week came in January 1974. Edward Heath's government, in dispute with the miners, cut commercial electricity use to 3 days in 7. Factories stopped. A television ended at 10:30. Offices worked by torchlight. And the pubs opened because the pubs always opened and brought out the candles. And they bought candles in bulk from wherever candles could still be found and put them on the bar tops. Something strange happened. The combination of national crisis, physical warmth, and candlelight produced in the public bars of pubs across the industrial North and Midlands a mood that was almost festive. The power cuts did not damage the pub. In some ways they improved it. People came who might otherwise have stayed home watching television, except the television wasn't on. So they came to the pub instead and stayed later and talked more, and the lock-in started earlier because nobody wanted to leave. The lock-in was illegal, everyone knew this, and nobody particularly cared. At some point after last orders at 10:30, the landlord would make a sign, a look, a particular stillness, a way of moving around the bar that meant certain glasses were not being collected. The curtains were drawn, the door was locked. The people inside understood they were staying. The people outside who knocked were simply on the wrong side of something, standing on a dark pavement in the cold, while 30 yards away the conversation was getting better and the drinks were still coming. Inside something shifted. The official world was locked out. You drank and talked and the hours became elastic. The particular quality of a lock-in that sealed slightly conspiratorial warmth, the knowledge that you were somewhere you technically shouldn't be, could not be found anywhere else in the 1970s social calendar. Nobody questioned it. And it was just what happened after 10:30 if the landlord liked you enough. Pubs at the start of the 1970s barely served food. What they had was a large glass jar of pickled eggs on the bar, swimming in vinegar, bought for a few pence and eaten standing up. A Scotch egg under a glass dome beside a pork pie and a sausage roll, none of them warm, none of them needing to be. Ready salted crisps in a bag, you split down the sides to make a flat sheet and put on the table for sharing. Pork scratchings. That was essentially it. For many people in the industrial towns, a pickled egg and a bag of crisps was lunch. Nobody thought about nutrition. Nobody was asked to. The ploughman's lunch appeared on blackboards in saloon bars across the country as the decade progressed. Bread, cheese, a lump of Branston pickle, perhaps a pickled onion, presented as an ancient English tradition going back centuries. In reality, it had been heavily promoted by the Milk Marketing Board in the 1960s as a way to sell cheese. By 1975, people believed their great-grandparents had eaten it in fields. It tasted fine. Its origins were a marketing operation. Nobody thought about this at all. Later in the decade, chicken in a basket arrived at certain pubs, then ham, egg and chips, then the Sunday carvery at the more ambitious establishments, queues out the door, the smell of roasting meat mixing with the usual cigarette smoke and beer. The food was not sophisticated. The point was never sophistication. The point was that it gave you a reason to stay another hour. The pub closed at 10:30, last orders were called and the bar emptied onto the street. And then the natural extension of the evening was the curry house. Indian restaurants had worked out in the early 1970s that pubs shut at 10:30, but people still wanted company and beer, and that serving a lamb madras with lager at 11 o'clock at night to a room full of people who had just left the pub was a viable business proposition. The curry house would serve beer with food, and when nothing else was open. A chicken tikka, rice, a couple of pints of harp. The whole table still talking at midnight, and the 1970s British evening had a structure. The pub from 6 until 10:30, then the curry house until whenever, then home. It was as reliable as the timetable at the factory. If you grew up in 1970s Britain and your parents drank, you have a specific memory. The back seat of a Cortina in the pub car park, a bottle of Coca-Cola, and a bag of crisps, ready salted, split open, flat on your knee. The low roar of adult conversation from inside, the occasional burst of laughter, the thud of the dartboard. You could not go in, and the pub was an adult space, and adults went into it, and children waited in the car or on the bench outside. This was not considered cruel. This was just how it was. Nobody questioned it. Sunday lunchtime was its own institution entirely. The pub opened at noon on Sunday, and the knocking on the door started at 5:02. The same men who had been in on Friday and Saturday were back again, this time sometimes with their wives, sometimes with children in the car park. The Sunday session had a different quality from the weeknight drink. Slower, more settled, the week's work behind you and the afternoon still ahead. You would be in by 12 and out by 2. And back home for the Sunday roast your wife had been cooking since 10. That was the shape of Sunday. It had been the shape of Sunday for as long as anyone could remember, and nobody saw any reason to change it. What the pub was, underneath everything, was the warm room. Your house in the 1970s might have had one fire in the front room and cold everywhere else. The bedroom was cold, the kitchen was cold, the bathroom, where there was one, was cold. In the pub had a heating system that worked and company that was already there when you arrived. After the factory or the steelworks or the pit, you stopped in on the way home, not to get drunk, just to be somewhere warm with other adults before returning to the domestic world. The man handed his wife the wage packet on Friday. She gave him back his beer money for the week. And he went to the pub with it. Everyone understood the arrangement. What ended this world arrived in pieces. The breathalyzer existed since 1967, but its cultural grip tightened through the late 70s and embedded itself through the 80s, and with it went the village pub that survived on people driving 3 miles and driving home. The 1988 Licensing Act gave pubs the option to stay open all afternoon. Supermarkets began selling beer at prices no pub could touch, and the smoking ban came in 2007, and with it went an entire category of person who had spent every evening in the pub, partly because they could smoke there. But in 1974, in 1976, in 1978, none of this had arrived yet, and the pub stood where it had always stood and did what it had always done. What remains is specific, the weight of a dimple pint glass in the hand, and the smell of the pickled egg jar when the lid came off, smoke in layers below a low ceiling, baby cham in its little branded glass, change from £1 after a full evening. The candlelit bar during the power cut, and everyone deciding without saying so to stay. The curtains drawn at 10:30 and the click of the lock. The curry house afterwards, still talking, still drinking. The back seat of the car outside, a bottle of Coke. The sound of the pub through the wall. The 1970s pub was the warm room. It was there every evening for everyone, for the price of a few coins. Nothing since has quite replaced it.